A very warm welcome to all of you to this webinar on autism, worship, and the senses. The webinar is organized by the Center for Autism and Theology. My name is Leon van Ommen. I'm one of the co-directors of the center and also senior lecturer in practical theology at the University of Aberdeen. Before I introduce the webinar, let me very briefly give you an introduction to the center. The Center for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 by Professor Grant McCaskill, one of our colleagues here, and some other colleagues in the Department of Divinity at the University of Aberdeen. The center aims to be an interdisciplinary or host interdisciplinary research into autism in relation to theology, church, and faith. As such, we hope that the center can function as a hub that brings together all those interested in this intersection of autism and theology. In this way, we hope to contribute not only to the academic world, but also to be of service to the church and also other faith communities. As part of our activities, the center organizes 2 webinars per teaching term, so that's for a year. So do take a look at the website to find out more what we are doing, more resources, and such as the podcast that we also run. And of course, you can follow us on social media. We are really excited to present to you some of the results of the research that Dr. Katie Unwin and myself have been doing over the past few years on the sensory aspect of worship. The outline for this webinar is as follows. First, I will give you an overview of the research project. Then Katie Unwin will present one part of the research, which was based on a questionnaire. Then I will present another part of the research in which we sense-scaped 5 churches, and what that exactly means, I will explain when we get there. And then 2 brief presentations will follow. First, a presentation of Bible studies that we developed, and that is presented by Dr. Hannah Kundil, who was instrumental in writing these Bible studies. And then we are also very excited for the last presentation, a very brief overview of a new website that we created to contain all this research. That will be done by Madeleine Schofield, who is one of our autistic consultants on the project and who developed the website. This will take about 45 minutes. After that, we will have a 5-minute break, and during the break and after, you can type your questions in the chat box, and we will have a time of Q&A. So, without further ado, let me introduce the research project to you. And for that, I'm going to share my screen. Right, so this webinar is titled Autism, Worship and the Senses, and that's exactly what the research project was about. And before I go any further, let me just say that fidgeting, stimming, doodling, etc. is absolutely allowed. Right, autism, senses, and the church. There are 2 starting points for this research project, or 2 kind of axioms, if you want, that we started with. The first one is that if you want to understand autism, you need to understand the senses, sensory processing, and everything that has to do with the senses. The second thing is that if you want to understand church, you also need to look at the senses. Church services, worship services, liturgy, whatever term you use, are highly sensory events. So Katie and I were thinking, what if you bring those 2 things together? So the sensory aspect that's so important to understand autism, and worship, church service as an embodied and therefore also a sensory event. So those were the starting points of the project. A research question that we asked, so the overall question that kind of guided our entire research project was, what is the experiential and theological role of the senses in corporate worship? And our aim was to support churches in creating worship spaces and practices that enable autistic people to participate, so churches achieve their aim of facilitating the worship of and encounter with God. The project title was a mouthful. I'm just putting up here, Senscaping the Liturgy, the role of the senses for autistic and non-autistic worshippers, an interdisciplinary interpretation. And this was very generously and kindly funded by the project New Visions in Theological Anthropology, run at the University of St. Andrews, funded by the John Templeton Foundation. And we are really grateful for that funding that enabled us to do this really exciting research. So let me give you an overview of what we did. First of all, we did a quantitative study. And as I said, Katie will explain more what we did. But basically, we compared the way that autistic and non-autistic people experience the sensory aspect of worship. And then the second big part of the project was what I already said, senscaping 5 churches. So what we did there, and I will say more in a minute, was we visited 5 different churches and we tried to measure sound, humidity, so the sensory aspects that you could measure, and then also hear from people in the church in focus groups how they experience the sensory aspect. This resulted in a number of outputs, if you want. So we wrote journal articles. So there's one already published, and you see an image there, autistic and non-autistic experience of the sensory aspects of church service. And there's more hopefully coming soon. Then we created the Bible studies, a Bible study series of 4 studies, and for use with individuals or groups. We created the website, and we will present Bible studies in the website today at the end. And then there will be a booklet coming soon, and soon-ish, we're really excited. We are writing a book about this because there's just so much to tell, more than we can in just a couple of journal articles, more than we can on a website or in this webinar. So we finally decided there should be a book. Really excited about it. Right. That's an overview of the project. And now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Katie Unwin, and she can introduce herself and also the quantitative study that we did for this project. Katie, over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Leon, and it's so lovely to be with you guys today to be able to talk about this research. As Leon said, it's one piece in the puzzle, but I hope that you'll find it interesting, and I obviously welcome questions in the Q&A section at the end. So we were interested in looking at this idea of sensory aspects of the church service in both non-autistic and autistic people, and looking at the differences between autistic and non-autistic people. And the reason why we were doing that is what Leon somewhat explained, and then also for a few other reasons as well. So the main thing to say is that this does come from our published paper, which has been peer reviewed, which in the sciences in particular suggests that the methods we used were independently and blindly peer reviewed by people in the field who are experts to say that our methods are legitimate and our findings are legitimate. And that's how we know that we can trust what I'll be presenting today. And if you'd like to read the paper or get more detail, this is a QR code for it to be able to follow along if you'd like to. So let's start off by talking about what sensory experience really is. So we experience the world through our senses, and our senses can help us to enjoy an experience and stay safe, but they can also make it difficult for us to engage. And this is especially the case for those whose sensory systems may work differently. And this is the case for autistic people, many autistic people. So they are expected. We don't really know. We don't have great numbers, but we think that up to 90%, in fact, I just read a paper the other day that said 95% of autistic people have some kind of sensory difference. So what we take from that is it's impacting a huge number of individuals within the autistic population. And importantly, they have high impact. So it's not just that they impact lots of people, it's that their impact themselves is actually really significant. So it impacts participation in a whole range of things that make life wonderful as a human. They impact daily life, family life, schooling, and many, many other things. And so we know as a research community that this is an important topic to be researching into. But there is also really high variability. What do I mean here? Well, it's not the case that sensory differences in autism is one thing and every autistic person experiences the same sensory differences. Actually, there are lots of differences between autistic people. So, differences between people. So, two autistic people may have two very different sensory profiles, and also differences by other factors such as age. So we're in a bit of a tricky, messy field because there's lots of variability, but at the same time, we're in a field where these differences really can impact people's lives, and a lot of autistic people experience them. So we need to be doing good research in this area. How are these sensory differences shown? Well, typically we talk about sensory differences in terms of the modalities that cause a sensory difference or that are part of the sensory difference. So this can be auditory, so hearing, visual, sight, tactile, and so on and so forth. This is not the focus of what we're talking about today, but they may be some terms that come up in the seminar more broadly that kind of help us think a little bit about what areas someone in particular might be struggling with in terms of their sensory processing. So how does this then relate to autism in the church? Well, estimates suggest that fewer autistic people attend church than non-autistic people, but this isn't necessarily because they don't want to. We see rates of wanting to attend church be relatively similar. And qualitative evidence has shown us this far that this is likely because of the sensory challenges that they don't attend church. And some of these sensory barriers that we've seen in the research so far, either research that Leon and I have done, qualitative research, or research from Eric Carter's group, has been things like bright lighting or discordance between the volume of speakers. There's been a lot of helpful qualitative information about these potential sensory barriers for autistic people to engage in church. But the key is that whilst these findings provide this depth of insight into individualized experience, we really can't generalize that out to the wider autistic population. And that's why quantitative research is needed. And this is the first study in the area that has quantitatively tried to look at these ideas amongst a much larger group of autistic and non-autistic people. So I hope that's got you excited for the study. So what were our research questions that governed our methods? Well, the first one was we were interested in whether there are any differences in the experience of sensory aspects of the church service between autistic people and non-autistic people. And then we were also interested in finding out whether autistic people report that the sensory aspects of the service make attending church difficult or reduce attendance. Why this second question? Well, because as I said before, we know that less autistic people attend church than want to, right? But we know that that might be because of sensory challenges, because of qualitative work, but we don't really know if there's a link there really quantitatively between those two things, the sensory aspects of the service and not attending church. And so that's what we wanted to look at. And to say at this point as well, we actually looked at a whole lot of other things in this study. It was a much bigger study than what I'm going to present, but we haven't got time today to go into it. So these are the things I'm going to. So the participants that we recruited were from Prolific Academic, which is a site which holds thousands and thousands of people willing to take part in research. In order to take part, they had to be resident in the UK, Australia, or Singapore. They needed to have either an official, a self, or no diagnosis at all of autism. They needed to be fluent in English, identify as a Christian, and participate in regular religious activities. Now, this isn't our terminology, regular religious activities. This is from Prolific, but what it came up with was it was screening out participants who didn't attend church. And obviously, that was important for us because in order to tell us how you engage in church, you need to at least have participated once or twice at a very minimum in church to tell us whether the sensory aspects impacted you or not. And so this is a little bit about our sample. So in our sample, we had 80 autistic individuals, 29 of them male, 49 female, chose the other option, and the mean age amongst this sample was 36 years. And then we had 61 self-diagnosed autistic. So the 80 were officially diagnosed, these 61 were self-diagnosed. And again, we saw very similar split in ages and how their gender. And then we had our bigger sample of non-autistic people, 156. And again, whilst we see, the mean is slightly higher for age, that wasn't statistically significantly different. So we know that these three groups seem to just be differing on whether or not they are diagnosed with either self or officially autism, as opposed to other factors such as their age. But what's really interesting from our sample, and in fact we're seeing this a lot across autism research more broadly, is that in the population, our autistic and our self-diagnosed autistic participants responded almost exactly the same as each other. So what we ended up doing was we ended up merging these two groups into one group that we're just going to call autistic. So there were 141 what we're now calling autistic group of people, and this includes both officially diagnosed and self-diagnosed people. Now, we want to be clear here that we're not making any point about whether or not a self-diagnosis of autism should be considered in the wider world as an official diagnosis. In some ways, there are reasons why that perhaps wouldn't be such a good thing. But statistically speaking, these two groups behaved exactly the same as each other. So it's appropriate in this context for us to consider them as just one group. So these are the two groups that we compared. But what did they actually do? What did we compare? Well, they completed a questionnaire that we created for this research called the Sensory and Worship Questionnaire. And we developed this based on earlier qualitative work and also broader autism sensory literature. I have a background in psychometrics and creating measures, and so that was sort of what led us to create this, because also there was nothing in the field that we could use that was already created and validated that would meet the purposes of our research. And we underwent extensive rounds of revision following autistic consultation to ensure that the measure itself was understandable, was measuring what we thought it was, and also that the autistic community were kind of happy with what we were doing, and it made sense of their lived experience. And so what we ended up with was 44 statements about the sensory aspects of the church worship service. And these were statements like, I like loud music in church. And so what we got participants to do was we got them to tell us on a 5-point Likert scale how much they agreed with each one of these statements. So we said, for you, how much do you agree with X statement? And then we gave them the statement. And they could either put strongly disagree all the way up to strongly agree. And as you can then imagine, we created scores based on that. And so a higher rating indicated or indicated more agreement overall. And for the psychometricians amongst you, we had excellent internal consistency as measured on this sample for this measure. So what did we find? Well, we used an analytical approach called a principal components analysis. And what a principal components analysis essentially does is it takes everyone's responses to the 44 different items and it groups together the items that were responded similarly to by similar people. And so what this tells us is it's a statistical way of grouping those 44 items into statistical components, so into groups of items which make sense together. And then it was up to us as the researchers to look at those groupings and say, okay, well, what is something that actually classifies this grouping? What would we call this group? What are all of these items talking about? And fascinatingly, they grouped in a way that I guess in my wildest dreams I could imagine would happen. But this is what actually came out. So we found that there were 4 components and that these could be classified as items pertaining to barriers, so barriers to worship across the senses, items pertaining to facilitators, so facilitators of enjoyment of the senses in worship, items pertaining to accommodations, so needing and receiving accommodations, and then items pertaining to what we're calling control. And so what this control item was about having control of the sensory environment and the feeling of connectedness to God through that. So the next question we asked, having derived these components, is okay, but were autistic people and non-autistic people responding the same or differently to each of these groups of items? And the answer is, on the whole, they responded differently. So, as we may expect, potentially based on qualitative research, we found that more autistic people reported these barriers. More autistic people reported needing or requiring accommodations, and more autistic people reported wanting to have control over the sensory aspects of the service to feel more connected to God. And this is compared to the non-autistic sample. Fascinatingly, there were no group differences with facilitators. What does that mean? Well, that means that our groups of autistic and non-autistic people are equally enjoying the sensory facilitators of worship. And so it is not the case that, for autistic people, all they experience are these barriers and nothing good. Actually, no, they do. They experience these really, really good things, these sensory facilitators of worship. And they experience them exactly the same as non-autistic people. And so to our second research question, before I go ahead and talk about what all these findings might mean, do you remember we wanted to see whether autistic people reported whether these sensory aspects of the service were causing them to stay home or reduce their attendance from church? And we found that statistically significantly, the answer was yes. But I will talk about this later. We do need to replicate these findings. So no need to worry too much about these graphs if you don't want to. But essentially what they're telling us is that statistically significantly, autistic people reported that attending the church or worship service is difficult because of sensory input. And they also said that the sensory environment in the church causes them to stay home. And this is the first time ever that we've quantitatively been able to show this link between the sensory aspects of the service actually causing people to stay home. Caveat here, it needs to be replicated, but it is a really exciting first step. So to draw all this together and to consider what this might all mean, a very interesting thing for us was that the components were not modality specific. Now, what this means is when we asked the computer to tell us which components should be pulled out of these 44 statements, they didn't say, the computer didn't say, oh, well, we want one component that's called auditory and one component that's called lighting. Instead, the computer came out with these broader things like barriers and facilitators. And that's really interesting for us because that means that the barriers to church were across modalities rather than being confined to the stereotypical modalities we often discuss as impacted in autism, such as autistic people don't like loud music. And so what we can say based on that is that this provides us evidence that all modalities need to be considered when examining whether a specific worship service is accessible for autistic people. So whether or not you've understood my point about components not being modality specific, don't worry about it. What we're taking home from this and what this tells us statistically is that all modalities seem to be important and need to be considered when we're thinking about barriers and facilitators. So what else do these findings mean? Well, I touched on this before, but facilitators were enjoyed by all. So an example of a sensory facilitator from our work was when the church has a beautiful interior or is well set up, it puts me in a worshipful mood. Now, what we saw was this item and items like it, that autistic and non-autistic people were equally enjoying those things. And so we need to be thinking about not just stripping out sensory elements from our services, what people in the literature are calling sort of sensory whitewashing, but instead actually considering shared enjoyment of facilitators and including things in our worship services that are facilitating the worship. So now to a point about access to accommodations. As I said earlier, there was no significant difference between the officially diagnosed and the self-diagnosed autistic people on their need or requirement for accommodations. What does this tell us? Well, it's evidence that having an official diagnosis should not be necessary to access accommodations. So please never fall into the trap of saying, well, those people can't have accommodations because they haven't got an official diagnosis of autism. If someone is coming to you and saying they'd like an accommodation, let's try and make it regardless of whether they have an official diagnosis. But we do acknowledge there are accommodation challenges because everyone is different, aren't they? And so one of the problems that we've come up against in this research is, okay, well, what happens if specific accommodations that get requested by two different people are opposite, right? So what if one person says, I want the music louder, and another person says, I need the music quieter? Or that the necessary accommodation that someone's asked for is just simply not possible. As an example, warming a very old church building, which in the UK, as I know, having grown up there, sometimes not always possible. What do we do in this situation? Well, please don't abandon the cause. That's what we're saying. We propose that consistently pursuing increasing these inclusive practices alongside community members should be as much the goal of what we're doing in church services as actually enacting in every accommodation. So a lot of people have said to me when we've been presenting this research, oh, well, we can't do everything for everyone because what if they're different for two different people? We just won't bother at all now. No, don't do that. Don't stop there. Just because one accommodation might not be possible, hearing someone out and helping them find maybe other ways of having that accommodation is a really valuable thing. But the key thing is that as a community, we want to be consistently pushing towards trying to support our brothers and sisters in order to be able to engage in the service. So I wouldn't be a scientist if I didn't come up with some limitations for this research, and there are limitations that you should be aware of. This is the first study in this area, which is really exciting, but we need to replicate these findings before we can go and say that they are really, really legitimate. And really importantly, the research question 2 that I presented about autistic people basically staying home often from church because of the sensory differences that they experience and sensory input in church. This was only tested using 2 items of the questionnaire. And what that really means is that a dedicated study is needed with multiple items. And so we can't put too much stock in that. Whilst it's a great first step, it isn't the last word on the topic. And, you know, Leon and I acknowledge that for this piece of research in particular, the methods that we employed are really likely to basically only have gotten data from really individuals with higher levels of ability and self-insight, and may have excluded those with intellectual disability or difficulties. We're trying to address that through work that we're doing now that's also funded by the John Templeton Foundation. But in this particular piece of research, it's unfortunate that that's the case. But if you want to know more about these recommendations that come from research, Maddie is going to be talking us through the fabulous website. And this is the bit that you can find those recommendations in. So that's everything from me. Thank you so much. And I'll hand back.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was a wonderful, uh, very quick tour around some of our findings. That was brilliant. Thank you. I suggest that we just take a 1 minute break. So after all the presentations, we will have a 5 minute break. But now, just to pace ourselves to have some processing time, I suggest that we have just a 1 minute break, and then we'll back for the second part of this study. Welcome back, everyone. So let's continue the presentation of our research. I'm going to share my screen again with you, so give me just a couple of seconds. There we go. All right, so Katie just gave an overview of the quantitative study that we did. I'm now going to talk about what does that look like in the actual practice of some churches. We tried to compare autistic and non-autistic experiences by doing focus groups. Now, methodologically, it turns out that it was impossible to make a real comparison. But what we were able to do was to listen to the experience of people that went to church. And in each of the focus groups that we did have autistic people as well. So their voices are represented in that way, but we were not able to make a comparison. Okay, so we visited 5 churches in order to senscape those churches. So senscaping, what does that mean? It's a word that we don't use every day. And well, you could say that just as you can describe a landscape in terms of the trees, the lakes, the roads, the mountains, etc. A senscape is made up of all the senses and how they are experienced and valued. So you enter a space, a church service, and there is sound, there is vision, you smell things, you touch things, all of that, and describing that together is then you're describing a sensescape. But also importantly, it's not just a description of what is there, but also part of the sensescape is how are they then experienced, how are they valued. Some people will give more weight to some senses than to other senses. So the valuing is important as well. And how do we interpret that? So how did we senscape these churches? So we went to 5 different churches and we did quantitative measurements. We measured sound pressure, we measured frequency, we measured humidity, we measured temperature. So those things that we could measure in terms of the sensory input, sensory environment, we measured. But of course, there is a lot that we can't measure with instruments. We can't measure smell, for example, or touch is very difficult to measure. And so what we did, we took part in the worship services. We observed what was going on for ourselves, but then we followed up after each service with a focus group. So that was around 5 to 10 people. And again, in each group, there were also autistic folk. In one church, it was entirely autistic folk with their parents. So that was the focus groups. So that's what we did in terms of our methods. Now, the 5 churches were a Greek Orthodox church, a Roman Catholic church, an Anglican church that was quite evangelical, an Anglican church that had a Taizé-style Eucharist service for those who are familiar with Taizé, and there was an evangelical free church. The churches were in Australia, Singapore, and the United Kingdom. What did we find? That's what I would like to present to you. So we analyzed our observations, we analyzed what the people in the focus group said, and we came up with a number of themes. Well, I should say there was one overarching theme, and that was focus and distraction. And there were 5 sub-themes around that all kind of spoke into that overarching theme of focus and distraction. So the first one was senses that matter at the top there, and then going to the right in the circle, at least right on my screen, contextual and subjective, then the unintentional disuse of the senses or the intentional dis or use of the senses, balance and contrast, and then self-consciousness stroke social pressure. So I'm going to briefly explain what each of those 5 sub-themes mean, and then I will give, again, just as Katie did, an interpretation of that. What does it mean for us? All right, so the senses that matter. So one thing that we did in the focus group, we gave them a task. So we handed out these cards that you see on the screen with the senses on. Now, of course, some of them it's debatable whether they are a sense, and depending on the culture and the time and all of that that you're looking at, speech, for example, does or does not count as a sense. I know that Katie, from a psychological perspective is cringing at this point, speech is not a sense, she will say. Interestingly, some biblical scholars would say speech is actually a sense. Now, we can discuss that, debate that, but that's out of the scope of this webinar, of course. But just so you see the cards here, and we ask people to rank them in order of importance. What is important to you? What's not important to you? Interestingly, what we saw with a lot of people was that they put some of the cards on the top as being important. So here in this example, you see at the top sound, smell, dark, sight, and movement of self. So self movement, and then a lot of people had like a kind of a second a second place where they put the cards, and they were just not important. So it seemed that a lot of people were saying to us, well, you know what, for me, it's really important that the sound is right, for example, or that it smells nice, or the smell of candles is important to me, or the smell of incense, or whatever it is. That's really important. And as soon as that is kind of catered for, as it were, we're fine. All the other things are not so important anymore. So that was the first finding that was really interesting to see. And the second one is it's almost a truism, of course, that the senses are always subjectively experienced and that context matters. But it was really striking how much that played a part here in the focus groups and the role that contextuality and subjectivity played. So just a couple of comments on that. In terms of context, it was really interesting to see the difference between geographical locations. So again, we did this. We had two churches in Australia, and it was summertime, so it was warm. We had a church in Singapore. It was incredibly warm there, and we had churches in the UK. And again, in that same time zone that that was summer in Australia, it was of course winter in the UK. And I can tell you from experience that that can be pretty cold and pretty miserable. But then, interestingly, in terms of how the senses were experienced, that all mattered quite a lot. So in Singapore, someone said, "Oh, it's so important for me that it's cold," and what they meant was it's so hot outside. The space really needs to be air conditioned really well, and otherwise it will just distract me from worship. Again, it was all related to that focus and distraction as overarching theme. On the other hand, it was really interesting, just as an anecdote almost here. We went to one church, and it was one of those old church buildings that Kate just referred to. That you can't possibly heat that building, and it was pretty cold that day. And it was in a part in the UK where it's quite often quite cold and I would say miserable. And the people didn't comment on it at all. That was really interesting. I would say, oh, it's so cold and that it's just really important for me that it's warm. They didn't comment it at all. It was like, well, yeah, you know what the weather is like, so just clothe for it. We went to another part in the UK, and there was a lot of talk about the weather and the temperature in particular, not the weather necessarily, the temperature of the building. So it was interesting how different people in different locations make comments on that contextuality. Well, culturally as well, the context matters. So in Australia, we visited a Greek Orthodox church, and what struck us was that there was a lot of kissing icons, kissing the hand of the priest when they hand out the Holy Communion or the Eucharist. Um, and we asked about a question about it, and they simply said, well, as Greeks, we tend to embrace and kiss a lot. That's part of our culture. And that culture, of course, you take that with you when you go to church, or into the church space, as it were. Denominational context that matters as well, the style of music, for example, that people liked or disliked, and then liturgical context. So darkness, for example, was usually really disliked by people, but not if it serves a liturgical function. And then really interesting quote here from a participant, and that has to do with the senses also create the context. So senses don't they take place in an environment, but also the senses create an environment. And so here, Abigail, we called her, this is a fictitious name. Abigail told us, so I've got things that are most important to help me, like get in that church prayer sort of zone. So like the sound of the chanters and stuff like that. The smell. As soon as you walk into these churches, there's a smell that gets you. That's like, I know I have to change my behavior and my thinking from like who I am outside to like be nicer and calmer and be more open and like open my heart. So as soon as I smell, it's like, okay, look, we're praying. Isn't that interesting? How that sensory context brings Abigail into that prayer zone. And she was not the only one commenting on that. So obviously the senses are experienced subjectively. So for example, um, sorry. So for example, someone comments on moving images on a screen, like for example, moving images in the background of song lyrics. And they said, "Oh, that's so distracting." Someone else said, "No, all those moving images and videos and all of that, it really helps to concentrate on the surface." Um, the temperature again can be distracting when it's too hot, too cold, or you are not bothered by it at all. Again, it's subjective experience. Now, 2 points to mention here and just to highlight is that it changes over time as well. So we got quite a lot in our focus groups that participants said, well, I used to, for example, like a particular smile. Now I don't like it anymore, or the other way around. So the sensory experience changes over time as well. Um, and really interesting and something to highlight here, almost without a fail, people across all the churches said, when I have certain kind of responsibilities in the service, then it changes the whole experience. And usually in a way that cause them to lose concentration or lose focus on the service. So responsibilities could include being an usher or making sure that the lights are right or doing the tech or whatever. So that really changed the experience. That's just very interesting point, I think, to highlight here. There's more to say about that point, but we need to move on now. The third theme, slightly complicated with all the brackets there, but it's the unintentional disuse of the senses, or the intentional disuse of the senses, or the unintentional use or the intentional use of the senses. In other words, you can almost curate the space by being intentional about the senses. Do you light candles, for example? In some churches, you do that. Well, it creates a particular smile, as Abigail said, for example. Or how do you curate the lighting? Is a slightly darker space? Is that comfortable? Is that fun, nice? Should it be about being comfortable? All those kind of questions you can start raising in terms of the spaces. And we found that, again, that level of control that people have is important. So we found that in the quantitative study, we also saw that in the focus groups, you could analyze the intentional or unintentional use of the senses in terms of where does the input come from? Is it created by something outside? If you're control, like for example, the smell of a building, there is very little that you can do about it, at least not just instantly. Or the smell of old hymn books, for example. So those are givens in the environment. Okay, how can you deal with that? Do you have any control over it or not at all? So you can start asking all these kind of questions. Right, then the fourth sub-theme was balance and contrast. So that was interesting again. There was quite a bit of talk about balance and contrast. Um, Again, Katie has already mentioned that example, like stereotypically, almost we say, oh, autistic people don't like loud music, for example. What we found earlier in an earlier project, and again here, was very often it has to do with balance more than with the volume. And so again, we heard that if speakers are off balance, that really throws people, or um, yeah, that would be a good example actually. Or if instruments are out of tune. So those kind of things are maybe more upsetting or distracting than the volume of music itself or the volume of the speaker or whatever. Um, and then also the senses were also spoken of in terms of contrast. In one particular church, it was really interesting that so this was a Greek Orthodox church, and we went there early in the morning when they started with their matins or the morning prayer, and then that goes into the divine liturgy, as it's called in the Orthodox tradition. And when that transition point is from the matins, the morning prayer, to the divine liturgy, all of a sudden the chanting picked up, the chandeliers came on, and it was this like huge contrast in sound, in light, and it was very clear that something was happening. And that's also what people in the focus group said, like, yeah, that's the point where we just know something is happening. Right. And so again, how do you use the senses and all of that? The balance and the contrast is, or the contrast between silence and sound, for example, that was commented on as well. And then finally, the focus and distraction theme was seen in people being self-conscious. So there was one church where the chairs were quite close to each other, so there were quite small chairs, and people commented a lot in that focus group on how they absolutely hated that because they were very conscious of, well, bumping into your neighbor and just touching the neighbor unintentionally. But it's just that just happened because, the room was packed and there were a lot of people sitting on small chairs and people being really self-conscious about that. But also being self-conscious about, do I raise my hands in particular churches, you raise hands when there's worship music and all of that. Do you raise your hands, or actually do you not do that? Or those kind of things. Do you dance? Do you move around? Those kind of things. And so people experience social pressure there as well. Social pressure as in conforming to particular ways of doing things, particular behavior in a church. So all of that again has to do with that theme of focus and distraction. Right. So what does that mean, or what might that mean? Well, interestingly, whilst focus and distraction were mentioned time and again, and all our themes relate to that as one overarching theme, very few folk commented on what that distraction was actually from, or what the focus was on. But the few people that commented on it seemed that it was related to primarily the cognitive understanding of worship, understanding what the words mean of a song, understanding what the preacher is saying, understanding those kind of things. So it primarily cognitive understanding of worship. So you could then say that, okay, we can account for the sensory aspect of worship simply in terms of it's either hindering or facilitating worship. It's either hindering that focus on the word, as it were, or cognitive understanding, or it's facilitating that. So if you have a hypercognitive account of worship, perhaps, yes, that's all there is to say, right? So if that understanding, the intellectual understanding of scripture, of preaching, of dogma, of the sacraments is the most important thing, then yes, the senses can maybe be just said to be either hindering or facilitating. But there's probably more to say. However, the self-consciousness of participants points to something more. So the urge to express themselves bodily, sensorially, by raising hands, by dancing, those kind of things actually indicates that there's more to worship than just intellectual understanding. If it's just about intellectual understanding, you don't need to dance, right? But the urge to dance, the urge to express yourself in bodily ways means that worship is more than about more than just cognitive understanding. And so maybe one thing, just to give a few thoughts here, and there's more to say, but maybe sacramental knowing is sensory knowing, or sensory knowing is maybe sacramental. Maybe through our senses, through the embodiment of worship, we encounter God in a particular way that is cognitive, precognitive, bypass cognitive understanding. I don't know. Maybe all of them. It doesn't exclude cognitive understanding, of course. That's not what I mean. But there is a way of knowing that is sensory. And so, for example, when you look at baptism, when you look at the Eucharist, when you look at sharing the meal together, there is something happening there that you know in your body that is more than just that cognitive understanding. So worship is not just facilitated or hindered, but constituted by the senses. So, very briefly, because I think time is up, worshipping with all our senses and with all different sensory profiles. As Katie has already mentioned, everyone has different sensory profile. And so in this church here, a church in Mexico, just a picture that I found on the internet. I wish I was there myself, but I haven't been there. But you see all kinds of sensory elements here: the pews, the colors of the windows, the difference between outside and inside, all of that. So there's there's a lot of sensory stuff going on there. Are we worshipping with all our senses? And are we thinking about sensory profiles and different sensory profiles? Are we a church? Are you a church or a faith community where fidgeting, stimming, doodling, etc. is allowed? And with that, I'm back to the first slide, of course. If you want to know more about senses, autism, and worship, see the Bible studies and the website, and both are going to be introduced now. So Hannah has been, as I said, instrumental in writing the Bible studies, and she has pre-recorded a presentation on that, and that's what we are going to watch now. I think it's a 6-minute presentation or so.
Hi, I'm Dr. Henna Kundal, and I'm going to introduce you to the Faith and Our Senses Bible Studies, which have been produced as part of the Sensescaping project. We start with a short video created by Zoe Strong, which gives just a general introduction to the studies.
We have developed a Bible study series for churches and small groups that will introduce you to sensescaping, an invitation to consider how we encounter the world using our whole bodies. Sensing is part of every person's lived experience, but not everyone experiences sensory input in the same way. In particular, being autistic can mean that a person experiences the world differently compared to non-autistic people and compared to other autistic people. We recently carried out a research project where we wanted to find out about autistic people's sensory experience of church and the impact that this can have upon their Christian life and worship. This research opened up a wider question about how the sensory environment of church impacts all worshippers. Throughout this series of Bible studies, we will share some of the results of our research project and invite you to learn how your own sensory profile might impact your life of worship and prayer. As you get to know your own sensory profile and that of those who worship alongside you in your church, you may want to consider how the sensory environment of your church can be shaped in response to what you have come to know. Download the studies at autismchurch.com.
Now that you've had a general overview of the studies and what they are designed to do, I'm going to take you through just a few of the features of each study so that you know how to use the booklet and a bit more about what you'll find in there. There are 4 studies in the booklet, and I'll introduce each of those separately in a moment. Each study is designed to take approximately an hour for a small group to complete, but of course that is going to depend on your group size and how much people want to say during the discussion times. So group leaders can make decisions and adapt the studies to make them longer or shorter depending on your circumstances. There are suggestions for ways to begin and end each session, including prayer activities or topics for group discussion. But these can be adapted, skipped over, or shortened depending on the time you have available. So to introduce each of the 4 studies in turn, Study 1 begins with the creation narrative given to us in Genesis 1. Group members are encouraged to try a sensory reading of this often very familiar text. The prayer activities and suggestions for group discussion that are given before and after the main section of Bible study should help group members to start to become aware of the role that their own senses play in their prayer lives and in the way that they typically experience the reading of Scripture. This helps then to undertake this sensory reading of the text, and reading Genesis in this way helps to make what is often a very familiar text feel somewhat unfamiliar. In our pilot of these studies, some people commented that they noticed things in the text and learned things from the text that had never stood out to them before because they read the text in this sensory way. In study 2, then, we turn to the New Testament, and we start to think about why it is important that Jesus is not just an idea or a spiritual being, but actually became incarnate and lived among us. We think about what it meant to the first Christians to be able to say that they had seen, heard, and even touched Jesus. And we think about what that still means for us as Christians today, how we can still learn about God and about the presence of God by paying attention to our sensory experience. In study 3, we continue to focus on the ministry of Jesus, turning to the account of the miraculous catch of fish, followed by breakfast on the beach, that in John chapter 21 occurs after the resurrection. Through a close sensory reading of this story, we start to explore how sensory experience can interact with mood, how our bodies use sense data to make us alert or relaxed in different situations. This leads naturally into thinking about the sensory environments of our own churches, which can be calming and relaxing spaces, but can also be places of high stress for people with particular sensory sensitivities. We think about how Jesus created a calming sensory environment, a calm sensescape, on the beach for his anxious and exhausted disciples. And lastly, in the final study, we turn to the book of Revelation and start to think about the future hope that Christians have. We consider what the prospect of bodily resurrection means for the way that we think about our bodies and respond to the needs of our bodies in the here and now, particularly in relation to the senses. We also consider the rich sensescape of the vision given to us in Revelation chapter 22, and how, just like with the Genesis passage that we looked at in study 1, a sensory reading of that text can help to bring out aspects of it that might feel new or that we had not noticed before. So that's a brief overview of what you will find in the Faith and Our Senses Bible studies. Information on where to download the studies is there for you on the slide. And if you do choose to use the studies with your church or small group, do stay in touch with us, because we would love to get your feedback and hear how it's gone.
And that brings us to the final presentation of the evening, a brief overview of this website. It's a new website that we have for this project, autismchurch.com, developed by Madeline Schofield, who is one of our autistic consultants on the project. And we are really great that she developed this website, and just really excited about it because it was launched only last week. So here's a very brief overview. Maddie, over to you.
Thank you, Leon. Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie, and I've had the privilege of working out how we can get this amazing research into the hands of people and make it a bit more accessible, and just be able to showcase everything that Dr. Katie and Dr. Leon have put together. So this is the website. I'm going to take you through it. We've got a bit of an introduction here about why the senses matter and a bit behind the project, some of what Dr. Katie was going through about that methodology and where the ideas came from. We've got some explanations here about some terms that you are probably familiar with. We've got a bit about what is neurodiversity and also what is autism, of course. Then below here, we talk about the senses. So this is for people who might not be familiar with all of these different terms. When you hover over these, a little explanation comes up. So we've got the classic ones. We've also got some that you may not be familiar with, like somatosensory or proprioceptive. So that's just a fun little visual way to explore those a little bit. Then here we've got some of the key stats from the from the study. So this is just a fun little visual representation of some of these things. So for example, of the participants, 35% of them found that loud or unpredictable sounds in the church service were hard to deal with. So we go through the barriers here, but then as Dr. Katie was saying, there are also facilitators and things that made it better for people to engage in worship. So we've got some of those things here. You can take a look at them. Then here we've got a space for highlighting some of the quotes from different participants in the studies. There are some really interesting points of view and just ways that people describe their experiences of church. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. It's just great seeing what's going on for different autistic people and their experiences. Now, below here we've got why does it all matter? And this is taking a look at the theological angle of it. What can we do about it? What do we do in light of this research? So here is what Dr. Katie pointed to earlier, that we've got some opportunities of things we can do. So we've laid it out. If you're a pastor or a ministry leader, here are 3 things you can do on the left. We've got, if you're just a fellow church member, you're not autistic or neurodiverse, you're just wanting to help, what can you do? And then if you are a neurodivergent or an autistic person, so there are some examples of things you can do under each of those. Then we've got a resources page, so I'm going to take you back up to the top, and this is where we'll find the studies and the Bible studies. So over here, click on resources. So of course the one we're talking about today is this study. We've got just a brief overview of what that was, the 4 main findings, some of the key quotes, and then if you click here, you can download the PDF for yourself. Then below here, we've got the Bible studies. So you can download them here just by clicking on that. That'll be a PDF that you can then print out or email around and use in your churches. Here we've got some great books and podcasts. These 2 books were written by Dr. Leon himself, so they're fantastic. You can get a copy clicking on those buttons. We've also got the Center for Autism and Theology podcast. So they've got this great podcast. I've had the honor of being a guest on it, so go and check that out. There's an episode that Dr. Leon has done specifically on autism and the senses, which you can listen to here. Then a bit more about CAT, as Leon has already explained, we've got some of the past studies that they've done. You can view them on the publisher's website, or if you want to go look them up in the journals, there are some links to where you can find them here. And then we've got a brief little explanation again from Dr. Katie of what is autism, if people want to look into that a bit more. If you're curious about getting to know the researchers a little more, you can click here, find out a bit more about their backgrounds, where they work, and there's a little bit more about the centre there as well. So that's everything from me. I'd encourage you to go check out the website, and I'm really thankful to have been, a small part of this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maddie, and thank you for developing this website. I'm really excited about it, but then I've never had a website before, so I'm excited. Good, folks, this brings us to the end of all the presentations. It took a little bit longer than I anticipated, but we have time for some questions, but I suggest that we take a 5-minute break. During the break, you can type in your questions and we will moderate those questions, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible. But let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be back, and then we will finish around 9. Welcome back. Right, I'm going to read out some questions, and I'm going to ask Katie to join me here, and we will try to answer as good as possible. We're going to start with a question, Katie. I think that's one for you. Someone asks, was there any reference to denominations stroke traditions in the survey part of the study, and did this have any impact on the response?
Fabulous question. Thank you for that. It is data that we collected. We had a very extensive questionnaire that included that kind of thing, and we haven't yet analysed whether a denomination impacted it, but that's something that I am hoping to do at some point in the future, because I agree it would be really interesting to know. Sorry for an annoying answer, but we have the data. We will analyse it, but just not yet. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, for that. there's a question. Can you please explain why you used participants and churches from three different countries, and why these three countries? Casey, do you want to have a go at that
Yes,
question?
fabulous. It's because it was all part of the wider project, so the Sentscaping project that Leon presented on as well. So we knew we were going to be Sentscaping churches in the UK, Australia, and Singapore, and so we wanted there to be concordance between those three countries. It also relates, I guess, to the funding that we got. So the funding that we got was specifically written in to be about these three different countries. And again, at some point, I would be really interested to look at the data by country. Not something we've been able to do just yet, but it was because it was part of the kind of broader piece.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to add to that, there's always in any research project also just the practical aspects of it and what's doable, feasible. And in this case, I'm living in Aberdeen in the UK, Katie in Australia, and in Singapore we had very good relationships with a church that is centered on autism, which we included in the research as well. So that kind of determined the three countries. Yeah. Right, I'm going to next question, a question about stimming, etc. In regard to stimming, etc., were there any churches you encountered where it was verbally expressed from the front or in literature, such as meeting guides, I think, that said stimming, fidgeting was allowed and totally okay? Do you think autistic church attendees would appreciate this being done? I can maybe start answering, Katie. You can just yeah add to anything that you want to add. So did we encounter that? So as I just said, the one church in Singapore that we worked with that is centered on autism. So whilst it's not necessarily said every Sunday from the front that it's okay to move around, stim and fidgets and all of that, it's very clear in that community that that's totally accepted, and that makes for a very special community in that sense. And I've written about that church in earlier on the basis of earlier projects that I did with them. And one of the things that really struck me was that people were saying this church is really different. Here we don't receive judgmental looks. Here we are not shushed if the autistic person is not quiet all the time. So that definitely did make a difference. So that also answers the question: do you think this makes a difference? And would autistic people, autistic church attendees appreciate this? Yes, definitely. What I know so far is that that's very, very much appreciated if you can kind of give that permission. Just recently, I spoke to someone this week or last week. I spoke to someone who said it just makes such a difference if that acknowledgement is there from the leadership. So yeah, that definitely makes difference. Katie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, it was lovely. Yeah, that's great.
All right. Another question there. There was obviously some variation on which senses were important in inverted commas, but were there any that came out consistently on top in this respect? I can answer that from the focus groups, but Katie, do you know any? Do you want to answer from the questionnaire maybe, or anything else?
Well, just very quickly from the questionnaire, the answer is fascinatingly no. So that was the point I was making about the components that were statistically derived coming out as about things like, barriers and facilitators, as opposed to being about modalities. So there really was no one modality that was always at the top in the questionnaire study. And the fascinating thing for us then is that, statistically speaking, because there was no kind of top winner in terms of the kind of sense that was most important to think about, that was what led us to suggest that we should be thinking about all the senses. And I suppose, I guess what your point is also alluding to is it kind of comes back to this individual variation that I mentioned that we see not only in individuals who don't have autism, but also autistic people in kind of sensory needs and sensory differences. But Leon, what was the case in the focus group study?
Yeah, that was fascinating. That was slightly different, but there's various reasons for that. So the ones, let me put it differently. There were two senses in particular that didn't come up very much, and that was taste and that was smell. Now, the reason for that is probably because there is not a lot of tasting that we do in the worship service, right? So if you have the Eucharist, you have, or the Holy Communion, you've got the wafer or the bread, you've got the wine, or the grape juice, whatever you use there. But that's about it. Then, of course, we can talk about the coffee after the service, or the biscuits and all that. And actually, there were some comments on that. However, I wouldn't say that therefore those senses are less important. So what we get with the focus groups is more description of the way things are, and of course the interpretation of the people, how they interpret that. But if a sense is hardly present in our worship services, then it's not going to be commented on. So that might be an explanation why that was further down the list. Now, fascinatingly, dark and light came up a lot in the focus groups, and that was unexpected for us. And it's also maybe something that we don't associate with the senses directly. We think about vision, of course, but darkness and light, is maybe something we do not immediately think of. But that came up a lot. Some people really not liking dark spaces, for example, or others actually like it if it's a little bit darker because then they feel less self-conscious. Remember that one sub-theme. So yeah, those are a couple of reflections on that question. Right. Let me just look in the Q&A for some other questions that we haven't answered yet. Are you aware of any studies on autistic children and their experiences in church? If not, do you think your study would have any application to autistic children? Katie, do you want to start with that? That gives me just 30
Sure.
seconds to think about that.
Yeah. As far as I'm aware, there are some descriptive studies, so not qualitative studies or quantitative studies, people kind of describing experience in the literature and about children, particularly parents describing their child's experience. So, we think of that as like a proxy report. The research that we've done was very specifically on adults. We didn't ask about what it would be like as children. From my recollection, Leon, I remember there was a few moments in the focus groups where people were commenting on their own children's experience within the church. One mother would describe how her two autistic boys were very busy and running around a lot, but the church just accepted it. And so there were sort of comments in our research that came out. So it's certainly something that should be looked at. The problem is methodologically it's so hard because we always struggle. I'm a developmental psychologist by background. We always struggle to get good information from children that's consistent, and particularly considering that we may be interested in kind of younger children as well, who perhaps might be pre-verbal. It's harder to do. However, there is a developmental psychologist called Emily Burdett at the University of Nottingham, I think she's at, and she does a lot of work on spirituality in children. And so I expect some of her work may start tapping into some of these things. So not something Leon and I have looked at. Would be good to look at it, but it's hard to do. Leon, do you remember any other recollections from the focus group?
Not necessarily from the focus groups. As you said, there were definitely parents of autistic folk who commented on their children and how it was for them, for the children, and for the parents as well. I think one thing maybe to add is that the studies that you referred to, Katie, in terms of autistic participation in church activities, so less autistic people participate compared or relative to the general population. Those are studies with children. So that's interesting that those kind of studies are then, but that's very often based on the report of parents. So there's still methodologically there is something to say, well, okay, but what about the autistic children themselves, and can we talk to them as well? But yeah, as you say, it's not easy to do that. But definitely something to look into. Maybe relevant to say that at our center we have a couple of PhD students actually looking into exactly that question. So watch this space. Yeah. All right. We have time for some more questions. Let me see here. All right, this sounds like a methodological question. Katie, probably one for you. Is there scope or mechanism for your methods and methodology to be made available for use within denominations should they wish to carry out denominationally specific research into this area?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So at this stage, everything's still very new because it's the first time that we've done research like this. The sensory questionnaire that we've created is welcome to be used by other people, but you have to get in contact with us via email, and then we will discuss, how you want to use it and kind of help you with doing that if appropriate. Because there'll be situations where it just won't give the information that you do want. So we want to make sure that it's helpful for you. And in terms of the sensescaping that Leon was talking about, the equipment we used was really expensive scientific calibrated equipment to do those really precise measurements. And the protocol was very kind of scientifically rigorous because we wanted this to be great scientific research. So as it stands, that would be a kind of big barrier to churches doing it themselves. But there are other pieces of equipment available that perhaps would be more accessible to do that kind of measurement with. But one of my recommendations would be if a church has even a tiny bit of budget, one of the main things that is hard to do kind of on your own without a piece of equipment is really good auditory measurement. And that's why sound engineers exist, to actually go around buildings and give you information about sound. Because one of the things that we're writing about in the book at the moment is that whilst it seemed to Leon and I that actually one of the services we were in was really, quite quiet and nice. Actually, when we looked at the data, it turned out that the volume of the service was almost exclusively across the hour and a half, well above the threshold for hearing damage. And the reason why we think that was the case was because there was a lot of background noise. Everything else had to be turned up higher. But Leon and I were kind of filtering out what we'd heard in the service as kind of ambient sound. And so we weren't noticing it as it being particularly loud, but the audio equipment showed us that it was really loud. And so, if it's something you are interested in, then that's I would be really, really strongly recommending seeing if you can get a sound engineer to come in and measure the space and give you those kind of tips about what may be creating issues for individuals in your congregation. Leon, anything to add?
No, that was very good. Let's go to next question. We have time for one or two more questions, I think. There's two questions that are quite similar, or we can take together. Could it be helpful for autistic worshippers if liturgy is already familiar to them, providing a sense of predictability? That is one question. And the second that is related to that, did you find that autistic people were more likely to attend worship if they knew what to expect in terms of sensory stimulation? I would say we did not find necessarily that that was the case in our study as such. So I don't remember that anyone told us, oh, if I know exactly what's going to happen, then it's easier to participate. However, based on other studies that we have done, we know that is definitely the case. And so that sense of predictability, that seems to be quite important. And that is something that came out of the questionnaire. So, Katie, I'm going to hand over to you to talk maybe a little bit more about that.
Sure, yeah. So we didn't look at that specifically in the quantitative study, but as Leon said, one of the components that came out of the statistical analysis was this idea of control, and how having sensory control over the service, sensory aspects of the service, relates to a closeness to God. That was fascinating to us to find, because those items about feeling of closeness to God and control in our minds originally within the research, like we hadn't written it so that those would go together, but it turns out that that was how people were really experiencing it. So whilst we didn't ask the question to our participants, would having predictability or familiarity with what's going to happen in the service help you come to church, we found it in somewhat implicitly with this component around control, because the questions around control were all about being able to control the sensory aspects of the service to kind of improve predictability. So there was a predictability element in there. So I would certainly say that whilst we didn't look at it specifically, there was really good evidence that it likely would be beneficial for autistic people in enabling them to feel close to God, which is, I guess, one of the main reasons we go to church.
That's great. One final question, and then we will wrap up this webinar. Katie, this is something we have discussed endlessly together, so we are not going to repeat the debate that we've had between us, but maybe we can comment on this. So the question here is, not having had a chance to really explore the website, but any chance that a template for a church audit might be an option? Something along the lines of a template derived from the research, so churches could find out the specifics that would be most helpful for congregations to consider sendscaping. That's a brilliant question. As said, Katie and I have debated this for a long time, whether we should come up with something like a sendscaping tool or something like that. And originally that was the plan. However, what we found by doing this research, one of the things that really strikes us is that, first of all, doing a sensory audit can be quite complicated. I don't want to be kind of snob academic here or something like that, but it can be, as Katie said, like we use specific equipment that's just, expensive and all of that. But also everyone is very different. And what we found was, what we tried to do with the Bible studies. And so instead of the sendscaping tool, we came up with the idea of the Bible studies, because what we really would like everyone is to kind of be on board with the story that we're trying to tell here. And that story is that senses are important. They're God-given. That's why the Bible studies start with Genesis 1, and they are good. And nevertheless, they can be painful, hurtful, barriers and all of that. So what's happening exactly there? So we want people and churches to understand the senses. What is happening with that? And how are they important? How do they play a role in worship and all of that? And to us, that felt like maybe an approach that just goes much deeper than a template. So even though I'm still kind of in two minds about the whole idea about, an auditory tool, at least for now, we felt that this was maybe an approach that would help churches more than just give, an A4 with a template and an audit. Katie, I know you have strong views on this as well. Do you want to add a 1 minute or 30-second reply to that as well?
Sure. Just to completely reiterate what you said, Leon, it may be something we create in the future, but we, having been part of churches my whole life, I know that actually getting people on board with an idea is the first and most important step. And really what we want to do is we want to win hearts to this idea that we should be thinking about it. We should be thinking about inclusivity. We should be thinking about how we can make accommodations and changes. And those will potentially be really individual, regardless of a sendscape of the broader service. Actually having the openness for someone to come up to you and say, hey, look, I'm really struggling with this. Is there any chance we could make a change? And having the church be okay with that and the willingness to change, we think is so much more important than an A4 tick sheet of what may or may not be going on. If you're interested in this topic more, I do talk about it in the book, and Leon will also talk about it in his sections of the book as well. And so we hope you'll get a much longer and more considered response than what I've just said now. But for the time being, we love the intent, but, that's what we hope the Bible studies will do to begin with, is win people over to this idea, create an openness, and then one day there may be a measure that exists, but for now there won't be.
Yes, and again, it's the Bible studies. They can be downloaded from this website. The website we also created exactly for that reason, to give more information about the senses and all of that. And so we are just so excited that we were able to present our research tonight. So on behalf of Katie and myself, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. It has been a delight to present these highlights from our research. It has been a delight to see this website come live and to see so many response to the webinar. So thank you all for joining tonight. Do stay in touch. Email us at cat@abdn.ac.uk if you want to keep up to date of our research, other research projects going on in the Centre for Autism and Theology. If you want to sign up to our newsletter, just get in touch. Thank you so much, and see you next time.